Well, welcome. I'm Chris O'Connor from the Heart Failure Collaboratory. This is our podcast, Heart of the Matter. And today we're discussing in more detail the challenges of site-based research. What goes into those barriers, those obstacles, those opportunities to be a successful site-based researcher? And I'm joined here by some of my distinguished colleagues. I'll ask them to introduce themselves. Joan Lindenfeld.
Hi, I'm Joan Lindenfeld. I'm a heart failure transplant cardiologist and professor of medicine here at Vanderbilt.
Thank you, Joanne. Dr. Nancy Sweitzer.
Hi, Chris. I'm Dr. Nancy Sweitzer. I'm a professor of medicine and heart failure transplant cardiologist at WashU in St. Louis. I'm also director of clinical research, vice chair of clinical research in the Department of Medicine.
And also editor-in-chief of
Circulation Heart Failure.
Yeah. Thank you. And Dr. Melvin Echols.
Hi, Melvin Echols. I am an associate professor of medicine at Morehouse School of Medicine and also a general heart failure cardiologist and the associate director for the Cardiovascular Research Institute at Morehouse School of Medicine.
Well, thank you, Melvin, and thanks all for joining. Before we started, I wanted to pay a tribute and a moment of silence of two of our distinguished colleagues who we lost over the Thanksgiving break, suddenly and unexpectedly. For Mike Bristow, who has been a international leader in our community, the heart failure community, but the cardiovascular community has been really pushing forward concepts of pharmacology. That's one of the founders of beta blocker therapy in heart failure, one of the premier leaders in understanding pharmacogenetics and pharmacogenomics in the cardiovascular space. We lost him, and it was just he's been a terrific mentor, colleague, teacher, leader, and friend for many of us. And we really hated that he left us suddenly. He was to be on this podcast today. It was on his calendar today. He was, in addition to his contributions to translational science, he was very involved in the Heart Failure Collaboratory. He co-chaired the research culture working group with me and was passionate about site-based research. In fact, co-led our symposium at the American Heart Association just a couple of weeks ago. So I hope that people will remember Mike for his terrific contributions. And Melvin, you might want to mention Kelly McCants.
Yeah, definitely. And to your point, Dr. Bristow will be severely missed. I so enjoyed interacting with him and learning from him. So I'm, devastated. I think on the same hand, someone who was also near and dear to my heart, Dr. Kelly McCants. We lost him this past weekend as well, and very unexpectedly young, and also an African-American cardiologist that really spoke to the dedication that it takes to mitigate disparities in this space. And so we really, our hearts go out to him, his family, condolences all around. And so he will dearly be missed.
Thank you, Melvin. And let's just have a moment of silence for both. Okay, well, today we're talking, and I know that Mike and Kelly would be proud that we're talking about a topic that's dear to both of their hearts, and that is how can we get site-based research going in the right direction again in the United States? It's just been a challenge. We've seen enrollment rates drop from 0.4 patients per site per month to all the way down to that level. It used to be about 1 patient per site per month. And it continues to be a challenge. But let me just start with Dr. Sweitzer and maybe give us a global view of what you see as some of the challenges for the site-based investigator and coordinators.
Well, thanks, Chris. There are a lot of challenges, but I think let's start with a couple things, fundamental to the challenges that we're demanding more of our clinical providers. And the time for visits is ever shortened, it seems like, by health systems who are motivated primarily by, making enough money to continue the mission, which is, of course, essential. But I think, sadly, less and less motivated by discovery and science. And you find whole health systems now, even those partnered with academic institutions, who have maybe a little bit lost sight of the research mission in the interest of delivering ever leaner clinical care. And that is on the backs of the clinicians who are directly providing that care and who have been the clinicians whose heart and soul supports site-based research largely. Combined with that incredible pressure on the busy clinicians seeing the potential participants in site-based research are the financial pressures, which we experience in every area of life, and of course also in this area where payments for the work are far less than they used to be and allocated in ways that require enrollment of a patient before you see a dime, even though much work has to happen to get that first patient enrolled at any site. And so developing financially sustainable models for ongoing site-based research is an increasing challenge, and I think really an absolute key to doing this successfully. And then I will add as a sort of final challenge the fact that in the heart failure space, certainly, increasingly everybody wants to find the responders and phenotype the patients. And the amount of work to find those patients has gone up tremendously, and they're harder and harder to find the more we phenotype them. Combined with the fact that often I find industry is looking at epidemiologic surveys and saying, oh, this is what the patients look like. But at the sites they're enrolling, that's not what the patients look like. They look different. And so there's this disconnect between the patients they think they want in the trial and the patients they have access to in the trial. And I think that that's an ongoing and growing challenge as we increasingly phenotype the patients we're looking for in these trials, partly as a result of our own success in this field where we've got effective therapies and we're looking for those groups of patients still needing more.
Well, Nancy, you bring up some terrific points, and I want to come back to the health system point later in the conversation. But Dr. Lindenfeld, you help co-lead a survey looking at the issues facing sites. You surveyed a number of sites and have been involved in clinical trials, and there was a number of obstacles that were presented in that survey. Can you give us your ideas, your curation of that survey, your thoughts on what current barriers are today?
Happy to, along with Marshall Brinkley here at Vanderbilt, we surveyed about 33 centers with the help of the Heart Failure Collaboratory and the Heart Failure Society to ask what were the major impediments to doing site-based research. And to just give you a rough idea, we asked them to list the number one and number two, and time was number one for the investigator, having enough time to do this and having the time funded. And then the major limitation for starting up trials were the consulting process and how long it took and how many reiterations of putting the contract in and getting it back. So that would be one thing where improvements could really be made. Also, funding. How does the investigator fund their time? Now everything is a matter. Are there potentially RVU research RVUs, as you've brought up, to help fund your time? Because right now the reimbursements from the trial don't really cover that time. And then identifying patients, as Nancy brought up, is just a huge issue. You would think with the computerized medical record, it would be easier and easier, but it seems to be getting harder and harder. And then people thought that industry could really help with this because another problem that investigators found, particularly junior investigators, was having some recognition of the research. How do you get recognition in your own institution for your work you've done? And how do you get academic recognition for that? They thought that industry could help here by trying, if possible, to pay enough to buy out the time to do the clinical research, and also to try to find better ways to get junior researchers involved in studies and manuscripts that would get them academic recognition in their own institutions. So those are the basics of what we found.
And that's so informative, and we've got to come back to those identified issues. But again, we're hearing time, we're hearing cost as big drivers of what's happening here. And if the health systems are sometimes seen as the bad person, I want to say, wait a minute now, 50% of health systems are barely breaking even, just trying to deliver care. And if we think that, A plus care is being delivered all the time, every time at our hospitals right now, it's not. So we've got to think of a different way. And I got some ideas. But Melvin, you've been up front. You've been on the battlefield. You've been front line ever since you joined Duke faculty and were part of the Duke Lumberton Clinic, and throughout your whole career, you've been thinking about this issue. So give us your thoughts of why today is so challenging.
Well, so thanks, Chris. I think that, I've been fortunate to train in a wonderful institution that sort of provided a background that helped me focus on some of these issues, particularly for site-based research. And then, I've worked and actually also trained as a medical student at Morehouse School of Medicine, which is also what we term a historically Black college or university. And I can tell you that there are differences in terms of the infrastructure for limitations in terms of funding that become problematic. Now, where I sit now as a site-based researcher for an HBCU, we work with a safety net hospital, Grady. And what's really so interesting about this entire process is that, it is totally ironic that the fact that HBCUs have investigators that are passionate about health disparities research, and they oftentimes are associated with populations of patients that, investigators and sponsors are usually looking for. And so, the irony here is that in these, situations, these places actually have the hardest or the most challenges in terms of trying to recruit patients just because of infrastructure, delays in processing in terms of payment or a number of things. And so I think that, sitting in this space sort of after 7 years of understanding sort of the real sort of grassroots challenges of site-based research in HBCUs, I think that that is something that we really need to think about. And I think that ways that we can centralize or decentralize processes that actually will help efficiency, I think those are the ways that, sort of are the way forward for institutions like HBCUs and community hospitals.
Well, that's so important as we think about how we get representativeness into our clinical trials, and an additional challenge above and beyond just getting meeting any sort of recruitment goals in a clinical trial. I come back to this. How can we fix this? And we've tossed around the idea of research value units. That's a concept. We've piloted it. Where does that money come? Does it come from philanthropy? This or that. It's hard to take it off the margins of health systems now. The average margin of a health system in the United States is zero. So a lot of people are underwater. And that is not going to get any easier. The costs on health systems is just becoming enormous too. Labor costs, inflation, supplies, everything. So that's not the answer. And I wonder if there's a government answer. Is there a modifier on the Medicare coding that we say, if you put a patient into a consents to be into a clinical trial and there's this mutual trust between the patient and the doctor to go into a clinical trial, should there be a modifier on the code, on the RVUs that are provided for that care that provides government dollars? Now, everybody said, oh my God, tax dollars, government dollars. But I'm worried that the infrastructure is going to collapse here if we don't have a creative solution for site-based.
Chris, I love that idea because I do think you can make a business case for this just based on what's going to happen with heart failure in the next couple decades, right?
Yeah.
There's so much heart failure, and as the population ages, it's just going to exponentially increase. And the government's going to be spending those dollars because it's a disease of aging largely. And so I do think there's a business case to be made here that ongoing participation in research and learning about therapies that reduce hospital days, save lives is compelling. And it's a case I think we need to make. with our leadership and our partners.
It's one of the things that okay.
I'm sorry. I do need to say this because it reminds me of Dr. Bristow and some of the things that he has said in the past where he has been an advocate for research being a benefit to patients. I think that, when we look at trial process, oftentimes, the concept is derived from an equipoise situation, and we often tell people, oh, well, if you're in the placebo arm, there's a chance that you may or may not, derive benefit. But I think that just even, and Dr. Bristol has said this, even being in the placebo arm, having that attention of a clinical trial improves healthcare downstream. And so I think that we need to start thinking about clinical trials and clinical research as benefit to patients in that manner. And so, as Nancy said, I absolutely agree. We need to really start kind of rebranding this focus because it's important.
And it could be, the collaboratories looking at whether we could get a demonstration grant from CMS to look at this concept. But Joanne, what Melvin said is exactly right. There's so much placebo effect that we see. There's so much actual disease management that occurs when you're in a clinical trial. That's how we build our disease management program at Duke, was based on principles of clinical trials. And then there's the GDMT that's so well delivered in clinical trials, and you've been a leader in doing that, Joanne. I mean, it's just the control groups are getting great care. Can we make that argument that research will help bend the cost curve for chronic diseases? And because it takes more time and effort from the clinicians to do it, that there should be a modifier.
I think we can make that case. We've known for a while that you do better if you're in a clinical trial, as Melvin said, and that hasn't quite seemed to move the needle. However, I think it's going to take a little more than that. Maybe determining that having your care where there are clinical trials ends up being more valuable. I don't know, some things like that, but I do think, to go back to the funding, there is funding for Medicare for transplantation, and it's Medicare realized long ago that if you're part of a transplant program, you do so many things that don't have an E&M code, selection committee meetings, talking up and downgrading the donor status, all of those things. So that now most transplant centers, 1 week a month, you keep track of your time that's not E&M coded for transplant and submit that to Medicare, and they pay that in salary. And I'm not so sure that that's not a model that we shouldn't think about here, because there are clearly, as you pointed out, benefits to patients, benefits to to Medicare, and also the better treatments we have, the fewer patients that are in the hospital. So I think we need to be really creative about this model. But I think government funding is going to be key to that, to help us, just pay not a huge amount, but just pay reasonably for the time that you spend doing things that aren't E&M codable, but have benefit to patients and to healthcare and to Medicare patients.
Well, your transplant model is really a terrific parallel. And thanks for bringing that up, because you're exactly right. That covers all the activity in between the direct patient care that goes into this. And there's a lot. And the same is with research. And could we start a demonstration project with the centers of excellence across the United States? We know who they are. They've been site-based research award winners, and build a cohort and say, okay, could we have something like this for chronic diseases? Obviously, we'd advocate the demonstration project for heart failure first, because there would be an ROI on that, as Nancy pointed out. And we know that we could bend the curve on heart failure hospitalizations, cost utilization, if they're in a clinical trial. So
Yeah,
this has been really exciting thoughts.
I think that's the way to start, Chris, but I think we could go farther than that and go with the cancer guys and that kind of center. I think we could ultimately envision centers of excellence for cardiovascular disease, and you would have to have 2 or 3 subspecialties, not all of them, where you actually enroll in site-based research, but then you could have funding that paid for the person that sort of runs the unit half-time or quarter time, a number of things like that, that would It would broaden that out so centers would have payment for all of those things ultimately. And I think we can make a case that it would benefit patients and benefit Medicare ultimately.
Yeah, I agree with Joanne. The NCI model is a really nice model that supports the mission.
And
Um, and cardiovascular disease seems to merit such a model in the United States. And certainly, if you can't convince people now, I bet in 5 years you could convince people.
And, last but not least, I think that we really need to make sure we tie whatever framework, whatever innovations to outcomes. Because, look at the implementation stage and you look at the landscape of heart failure. You look at how many people are actually optimized on all of these wonderful, evidence-based drugs that we have and therapeutics that we have. It's dismal. And so I think that when we're talking about governmental opportunities to support, we really need to tie to outcomes because when you look at the CDC Wonder database and CVT mortality, particularly for heart failure, we're starting to see rises again and these disparate changes. And so again, I think that whatever we do, we absolutely need to tie to hard endpoint outcomes.
I think that that would help with the NCI case, right? I mean, this is how the cancer institutes were founded, that the outcomes were better in that framework than they were when, you know, primary care doctors were providing cancer care. So I think that's absolutely true. I also think, I'm in Missouri and we're trying to build a rural research network in our state. And to get busy rural primary care clinicians engaged, I think that a model like this would help a tremendous amount, that they would get some credit for engaging because intellectually many of them are interested. They just don't understand how they could possibly do it in the frame of their day-to-day lives. So I
Yeah.
think that, thinking about ways to incentivize healthcare systems and interested PIs to move into this space as we go forward is so critical.
Chris, I know ACC is going to kill me. I did not tell you about my other hat, but I'm also the Chief Health Equity Officer for ACC. And I'm also very much an advocate of rural health, cardiovascular disease in this space. So kudos and dittos to what Nancy said.
well, and the last thing that we have to tackle is really education on how to do site-based research, and it should be, as you know, the collaboratory is using pre-medical students, postgraduates, fellows to really learn site-based research and clinical research. But this needs to be in the medical school curriculum and in the GME curriculum. And I think we really need to put forth a push in those areas too, because as we graduate people into practice, what happens is the tsunami of all the clinical work gets done and the skill sets on how to set up a site-based research is not trivial today. And so people just say, well, it's too hard for me to do. I can't do it. But this has been a terrific conversation today. Thank you very much for joining. And we will continue to push the needle on how to optimize site-based research in the United States and make it better. But you've come across some great ideas, and I think the collaboratory should take some of these on. So thank you, everyone. And please enjoy our podcast with Heart of the Matter, Heart Failure Collaboratory. Thank you.